There's a rather common sort of behavior or comportment that I've been observing for years and years. And when I was younger in philosophy, I did this myself. And I've been thinking about it, actually dwelling on it for some time, because it's a complicated phenomenon. I don't want to try to come up with shoot from the hip, simple judgments about things, because that's actually one of the characteristics of what it is that I'm going to talk about. And so, before I go into this, I should tell you what I am actually going to talk about. So for years, I've been observing in, YouTube comments and in classes and online and face-to-face events and conversations and other formats as well, that there's a tendency for people when they are reading, studying, learning, interested in philosophy, and perhaps even more broadly, to draw connections that are kind of there but not really there, and to lay too much stress upon this, to say X is just like Y. I think that these two things are connected or similar. And sometimes there are real connections there. Every once in a while we have these insights, and that's really awesome. But a lot of times these are what Socrates and the Theaetetus would call a wind egg. It's an idea that's actually stillborn. It's not really true. It's not really good. It's not really alive. It's going to be something misleading. And there's a tendency for some people when they're studying, particularly when they're first getting into things and getting quite excited, to lay too much stress on that, and to do so in ways that often reinvent wheels. And the response that I often give is, no, those aren't really connected in the way that you think. And you do better to actually focus on how these differ from each other rather than just how they're similar. So what are we talking about? It's people making connections. It's people noting similarities. It's people making comparisons and then coming to a judgment that says that what's going on over here in this thinker, in this book or passage or system or tradition or whatever it is the same as what's going on over here. And sometimes it's phrased in a rather, more tentative way. I kind of think that these are what's, going on here, and these are very similar to each other. Or couldn't it be the case, I would like to think that X, Y, Z. But it really comes down to the same thing, assuming and asserting similarities, connections that aren't as strong as we'd think. And this can extend even to making analogies, saying if this is the case over here, then we should also expect this to be the case over here. Now, I don't want to simply throw cold water, as they say, onto this and say, that's awful, you don't have any good grounds for what you're saying. No, I don't want to do that, because I think that there's something important about this. I think that this is a reflection of the way that the human mind does work as it's developing. And the human mind doesn't just develop by itself, it develops in relation to other people, right? Some of whom might be our interlocutors online or in face-to-face encounters in the same time. Some of whom might be from books that we're reading, their takes, their viewpoints, right? The important philosophers. Think about the fact that we can, in fact, read Plato and get his own takes, or at least the takes that he puts in the mouth of his characters, on a whole bunch of other thinkers as well. Sometimes we look at them and we're like, yeah, that's pretty good. And sometimes we're like, oh, he's being unfair to this person. So I don't want to discourage anybody from this behavior. I just would like to say, maybe you want to think about what you're doing and try to do it in a more reflective, a more prudent way, which will help you out. And I think it's just as important. So here's one of the takeaways from this. It's very exciting to note connections, to note similarities. it's just as important, though perhaps not quite as exciting, to pay attention to disparities, to pay attention to differences, to make distinctions, to be able to compare and contrast, to say, yes, these things are kind of the same, but they're also not the same. They're also unlike. They're different. They're perhaps even opposed to each other in certain ways. I want to say that you're not going to be as successful with just having the one without also bringing in the other. And this goes back to, ancient philosophy. I think really in basically every tradition, there's a tendency to classify things together on the basis of similarities, and then we have to make differences. We have to be able to say where they're unlike to each other and how they're different and why the differences matter. So how does this happen? Well, I think that one of the most common ways in which this happens, a dynamic, is that people are misled by language. And so it can happen in, a very, let's call it, rudimentary, naive way when somebody reads important philosophers in a particular language. We'll take English, which is, my native language, as an example. So let's say you're reading, a translation of René Descartes, and, it's the Meditations, and he's talking about ideas and thoughts and, things like that, right? And then you're reading somebody else, say Nietzsche, coming from German into English as well, and he's using the word idea, or Schopenhauer is using the word idea. And, you see that word idea and you're like, oh, well, we've all got ideas. Or we could also take an English writer like David Hume, right? The word idea isn't necessarily doing the same work. It's not necessarily referring to the same thing in all of these different texts and thinkers. And it might not even be doing exactly the same thing for the same thinker within the same work, right? There are different senses to terms, and we want to be aware of that rather than like blurring them all together and identifying or equating them with each other. This also happens once people get a bit of, sophistication and realize that a lot of the philosophy we have is actually translated from, say, Greek or Latin or other languages as well. And they pick up on certain terms and they see that this term is used here, and then they see it somewhere else and they're like, aha, these are the same thing. And I'll give you a prime example of this. The term logos, right? I've posted some videos a while back on Heraclitus and the fragments that we have from his work on nature, just fragments. That's all we've got. So we shouldn't really draw too much from them. We shouldn't go too far beyond an interpretation what we actually can, legitimately say. He uses the term logos. This is a common term in ancient Greeks. Plato uses it, Aristotle uses it, all sorts of people use it, right? It doesn't always mean the same thing in each of these thinkers. As a matter of fact, you can guarantee that what Heraclitus is calling the logos isn't the same thing as what Plato and his characters in the dialogues are meaning by it, or what Aristotle means by it, because logos has all sorts of meanings in classical Greek, right? One of them can be this reason underlying everything. You can say that the Stoics' use of the term logos sometimes has a connection with Heraclitus, right? Especially when they'll reference Heraclitus, but not always. And the kind of comments that I'll get are typically from people who want to equate the logos in Heraclitus with the logos found in the Gospel of John and say, oh, these are exactly the same thing. And no, they're not. They're very different from each other. And we want to attend to these differences rather than making all too easy and misleading identifications with each other. And, I can give you all sorts of other examples. The term virtue, or, in Greek, arete, right? It doesn't even mean the same thing in ancient philosophy necessarily from one philosophical school to the other. I mean, for Plato, strictly speaking, a virtue, although being a disposition in us, is really the form of that virtue, justice itself that my justice participates in. It's very different for Aristotle. It's different for the Stoics. It's different for the Epicureans. We could go on and on and on. And, we get to the modern period or especially the late modern period, where people throw around the word virtue and vice and very often have no clue what they're talking about. They just mean, something good or something bad, and they lose a lot of the resonances that go along with these terms throughout history. As a matter of fact, Alistair MacIntyre, devoted not just a book, but a whole bunch of books to showing how the concept or the notion or practice or whatever we want to call it of virtue and the virtues has changed from time to time and culture to culture. Critique, another term that gets used in a lot of different ways by different people. We got to be careful with this, right? Or another great one, phenomenology, right? Hegel writes the phenomenology of spirit. Somebody asked me recently, is that part of the phenomenological movement that gets started with Husserl? And there's a little bit of, fake history there as well, because there's phenomenology before Husserl and other strains that are going on as well. He's not the one person that everything goes through. But no, these people are using words in rather different ways. So we don't want to blur all of these things together, although there are commonalities and connections and sometimes even references back and forth to each other. So language is something that can, mislead us. Similarity of structure is a second very important way in which people sometimes get misled. They're like, well, it looks like this person in their account is doing things and they're making these differences or distinctions here, and that's like what this person is doing over here. I've seen this come up over and over again, so much so with certain authors that I actually did some videos about it. For example, Plato and Freud both have a tripartite breakdown of the soul or psyche or personality, whatever we want to call it, right? And there is actually a connection between one of the parts, what Plato calls epithumia. It's translated as appetite or desire for bodily pleasures. Freud, in fact, mentions Plato and calls that the id, right? There's a structural similarity between the two of them. But the higher parts, the thumos and logos, those are not in any way equivalent to Freud's ego and superego. I mean, you could try to draw some very superficial similarities. The ego is caught in between the id and the superego, just like the thumos is caught in between the rational part and the desirous part. But they're not the same at all. As a matter of fact, thinking about things that way will mislead you. You will either misunderstand Plato or misunderstand Freud or misunderstand both of them together by making a comparison and connection between them that doesn't go as far as you'd like to think it does. So that's a second thing. And I think that, we can also say, as a third thing that's kind of related, the project of this person or the purpose or the aim or the goal is this, and this person over here has a similar project or aim, so therefore they're doing the same thing. They could be, or they might not be. Even within the same school or movement or tradition, people aren't always doing the same thing. As a matter of fact, just to bring up MacIntyre again, one of the things that makes traditions healthy is ongoing debate and even dispute about what the hell are we doing here in this tradition. So we want to be kind of careful about that. I think that a fourth source for making these problematic conjectures arises out of uncritically relying in a not well-informed way upon various people's classification of thinkers or movements. These designations that we give that would lump in certain people with each other are often quite artificial, and they hold to some extent. They're convenient ways of putting things together in a box, but the more that we learn about them, maybe, some vital differences arise. For example, think about the distinction that you may have come across in the past between continental rationalists and British empiricists, and rationalism teaches this, and empiricism teaches this. And then you look at, let's take some of the big three empiricists, right? Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Yeah, they got a lot of stuff in common, but holy crap, do they have a lot of differences with each other? And then we start bringing in others as well and looking at interpretations of Locke or of Berkeley or Hume, or their critics within the same sort of movement. And wow, there's a lot of differences. And even more so for the supposed rationalists as well. Descartes is not Spinoza, is not Leibniz, is not Malebranche, is not Arnauld. And we could go on and on and on. People like to generalize about, German idealism. That's a pretty loose movement, and there's a lot of key differences within that. And it's, sometimes it gets difficult to say exactly where the boundaries of these movements or traditions lie. So you don't want to just take somebody's say-so for philosophers doing the same thing or being the same. You want to actually read the text and take a close look. And it is quite understandable that people who are studying philosophy, people who value philosophy, people who think that there's something rightly there to get out of philosophy, who find it interesting, who find it insightful, enjoyable, or even admirable, admirable in the sense of not fully understanding it, but being like, oh man, I think there's something there, would be led to draw these conclusions about connections or similarities. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and so they would want to, map or connect up or, bring together these different philosophers or their ideas or their points of view or their assertions or any of these sorts of things. It's really important. So now we get away from why this happens and why it's kind of okay for it to happen. It's really important to realize that a term or a concept or a distinction or a key practice or something like that, for real philosophers, they have a situatedness. They belong within a context. They're not just like hanging there as fruit to pluck and then take wherever you want and turn into whatever it is that you want. I mean, you can do that, but a lot of the matters that we work with in philosophy, they kind of lose a bit when we do that in the process. And so, paying attention to the wider context that we learn through studying a philosopher. If you're going to study Plato, you can make inferences after just reading the Euthyphro, but you're going to know so much more after you've read a lot more Platonic dialogues and you've reread the Euthyphro and you've reread those and you've gone back and forth and thought about them quite a bit. So I'm going to close here by saying, it's good to have these aha moments where you're like, man, what's happening here is what's also happening here. It's good. That's a thing that our human minds do. And we just don't want to base too much on superficial connections, right? So what can we do? We can not just note the similarities, but also look for how things are different. Think to yourself, hey, I see a similarity here. There probably is going to be some important difference. And, we should also understand that the positions that we have on what a particular thinker, if they are an important, and deep thinker, the position that we have is probably very partial, so we want to exercise a bit of intellectual humility when it comes to that and understand that there's a lot more for us to find. And then, the other thing that I would say is we want to be good conversation partners in the sense of sharing conversational space well. We should realize that others don't necessarily share our enthusiasm for the connections that we've seen. And if we do want them to appreciate these connections, first of all, we have to make sure that we're actually right about that and that we're not putting out wrong information as if it is correct. But we also, want to explain ourselves, not just shoot from the hip and say, wow, Nietzsche is doing the same thing as this person over here, or it's exactly the same idea. We don't want to do that. Instead, we should be a little bit more careful. And that's a set of skills that are important for philosophy as well, just as important as noting connections and having intuitive leaps or things, like that feel so good. We want to do the careful work both with the philosophers and upon ourselves. So I've already talked quite a lot about that. I'm sure people will have some views on this and opinions. And I do want to say this. I'll say this at the very end. I can relate, right, to this excessive enthusiasm that sometimes leads people to be dominating conversational space and saying, wow, this is exactly like this. I did it myself as an undergraduate. I did it myself as a graduate student. I'm willing to bet I've done it past graduate school. And, so maybe it just takes a bit of time and getting humbled from occasion to get yourself out of this. And so I'm kind of trying to save you some of that time yourself. This is one of those if the shoe fits, wears it sort of conversations. If it does fit, maybe think about what you're doing and whether it's good for you to be so interested in jumping from philosopher to philosopher. It's like, ooh, similar, same. Let's glom them all together. That's not really good for you. And it'll stand in the way of your own philosophical development. So, there's some things here to think about. Hope that it's useful for you, and I'll see you next time.